watch would you be married with?
Well, if I get that long-to-one tourbillon perpetual counter, I'll be good. This is Time is Money, where the clock is always ticking and money is always moving. I'm Thomas Hendricks for 2024 in New York City. We took a hibernation break for January, but we are back, baby. Here are 3 signs of the times for February 2023. After 10 months of falling prices on the secondary and gray markets, we're starting to see the first signs of a potential turnaround. We'll look to Rolex, Patek Philippe, and Audemars Piguet for clues. With the holidays in the rear view, we've rounded up the most gifted watches of the season. Think you can guess what made the list? The Omega Speedmaster has spawned countless limited edition and special edition models throughout its history. We put them head to head to find out which references have fared the best financially in recent years. Let's start with a quick check-in on the watch market. If you've been following this Time is Money series, you know that in-demand watches from Rolex, Patek Philippe, and Audemars Piguet have been in decline on the secondary and gray markets since spring of 2022. Inflation was going up, cryptocurrencies were going down, and tanks were moving into Ukraine. This negatively impacted the global economy, including the luxury sector. The current decline came after years of runaway growth in the watch market. And while it's true that what goes up must come down, it's also true that what goes down might eventually come back up. In recent weeks, we at Chrono24 have started to identify early signs of a potential turnaround. Of course, markets are always tough to predict, especially in unprecedented times like these, but let's look at some charts for clues. First, a bit of bad news. If you are looking to sell a Patek Philippe Nautilus or an Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, you may need to exercise a little bit more patience. Supply for 2 of the hypest of hype watches is still considerably high on Chrono24, and demand has so far remained low. A true buyer's market, one could say. We're seeing similar trends currently for sibling models like the Patek Philippe Aquanaut and Audemars Piguet Royal Oak Offshore as well. However, when it comes to Rolex steel sport watches like the Daytona, GMT Master 2, and the Submariner, for example, the tide may be starting to shift at last. Let's start with the Daytona. We're looking at the current production 116-500 LN in both black and white dials. It's important to note that supply is still outpacing demand at this point, as it has been since March of last year, and it'll be a long time before we see that level of peak demand that we saw in mid-January of 2022. That said, it appears that supply is trending downwards while demand is on the rise. When we look at the current generation Batman reference 126710 BLNR, we see a similar trajectory with supply and demand moving closer towards an equilibrium. Charts for the current generation Pepsi and root beer are also moving in the same direction, albeit with a little less momentum. Interestingly, enough demand outpaced supply for the Sprite GMT briefly in early January of this year before falling off later in the month. The Submariner is where we see perhaps the tightest gap between supply and demand. The current generation no-date Submariner, for example, reference 124060, is looking especially healthy. Of course, we need to be careful not to overstate the turnaround potential here. For the top 10 best-selling Rolex watches on Chrono24 and all Rolex watches as a whole on Chrono24, the situation is more lukewarm, with demand slowly rising and supply slowly falling, but it is encouraging to look at the heat map and see a few bright spots that indicate that maybe, just maybe, the worst is behind us. For our next story, we're looking back to see which watches experienced the biggest bump during the holiday season. Watches have always made great gifts, and this past year was no different. Now, it seems Santa forgot to give me my long-to-one tourbillon perpetual calendar, but I'm sure it just fell off the sleigh. Jokes aside, our data analysts did see 16 watches experience more than 100% growth during the holiday season. In order to arrive at this list, we compared a watch's typical sales in 2022 to their sales during the months of November and December. We made sure the watches had at least a few dozen sales to rule out any anomalies, and we also ruled out any watches that debuted later in the year, since that would skew the sales data. Case in point, the 39mm Tudor Pelagos was released at the end of August and had a whole lot of sales on the platform during the holidays. But we're guessing that many watch enthusiasts bought themselves a little gift. Oh, this package? It's a surprise, honey. I can't really tell you about it. The top 3 watches on our list saw a more than 200% increase at the end of the year, and all 3 come from Japan. At number 1 is the Grand Seiko SBG X261 with a 233% increase. Number 2 often sells for under $200, the Seiko 5 XNSS77. And number 3 with a 214% spike is the Seiko Cocktail Time Mojito Edition, reference SRPE 45J1. We saw other affordable watches with more than a 100% increase, including a couple Hamilton Khaki Fields, a Seiko Alpinist, and a Citizen that kind of looks like a Rolex Datejust, President, and Oyster Quartz all smashed together. Mid-priced holiday favorites include a Cartier Tank for Meal and the current generation Cartier Santos. The 36mm Rolex Datejust is also in there, as is an Omega Aquaterra and the Grand Seiko SBG A211. And I swear to God, we also saw an over 100% increase during the holidays for the Rolex Skydweller and the white gold Rolex Daytona. We turn now to the Omega Speedmaster. The Speedy has become the hallmark model for Omega, and like a Marvel movie, with success comes spin-offs. The limited edition program at Omega has been a cash cow for decades, and the running joke in the watch industry is that we now have an unlimited number of limited edition Omega Speedmasters. And to make another analogy, we see a similar business model for Nike, for example. You take a classic, you give it a slight makeover through a new colorway, and you reap the rewards of that recharge demand. Virgil Abloh coined this concept as the 3% redesign, meaning one only has to change the design by 3% to create something new. With that in mind, we've done some analysis to see which special Speedmasters get you the best return on your investment. The data comes from publicly available Chrono24 price charts on watches that are listed as being in very good pre-owned condition on the platform. First up is the Speedy Tuesday Ultraman Edition, developed in partnership with our friends at Fratello. You could have picked this up for roughly $9.1 thousand in February 2021, but it'll cost you approximately $15.8 thousand now in February 2023. Next is a personal favorite with the 1010 Speedmaster. 2 years ago, this was selling on Chrono24 for $12.2K. Prices surged to almost $19,000 in July of 2022, but they settled down to about $15.8 now in February 2023. On the more affordable end, the first Omega in space could be had for under $5K 2 years ago, but $4,200 specifically. Now discontinued, the price sits just under $6,000 today. The retail price for the Speedmaster reference CK2998 when it debuted in 2018 was $5,850. By February 2021, they were selling on Chrono24 for a little over $6,500. Now it's bumped up considerably to roughly $9.6K. Our second to last limited edition is the Silver Snoopy Award, what I've called the most expensive cartoon you can watch. This is the only Speedmaster on the list to have lost market value in the last couple of years. Our data starts in April 2021 with an average price of $27,100. Now it's down about $4,000 to $23.2 thousand. Finally, the biggest winner in our analysis is the Alaska Project Speedmaster. Back in the halcyon days of 2021, you only needed $12,500 on Chrono24 to make it yours. But now, this ship's gone into orbit with an average price of $21,500, almost double in the last 2 years. The question for Omega and Omega fans is, what happens next? Omega has historically relied on history for inspiration with a range of Speedmasters marking special occasions like anniversaries, galactic voyages, and the Olympics, etc. But some are speculating that the Moon Swatch might be the most likely path forward for special editions. There's a lot of potential here, and Omega could charge even more for limited edition model Moon Swatches, thus further increasing what must already be pretty high profit margins. The Moon Swatch was the most inescapable story of 2022, and even if you got tired of hearing about it or reading about it, the watch is a smash hit. There are even people making fan art for what they hope will be future versions of the Moon Swatch. And if you're Omega, you'd likely see a clear opportunity here to grow your audience, earn press coverage, make a lot of money, and release a new limited edition that doesn't have to be tied to the Speedmaster anniversary calendar. There you have it, a snapshot of the watch market for February 2023. I'm Thomas Hendricks with Chrono24. Thanks for watching Time is Money, because time only moves in one direction, but the market does not. We'll see you next time.